I always thought I had a pretty simple life. A steady job, a cozy home, and a wife who I loved more than I ever thought I could love anyone. Julia was my everything. We'd been married for 5 years, and while we had our ups and downs like any couple, I always believed we were rock solid. It was about a year ago when things started to change. I remember it clearly because it was the first time in a long time that I felt truly invisible. And it was all because of him. Jasper. Jasper was a horse. Yes, a horse. Julia had always loved animals, but after we moved out to the countryside, she became obsessed with the idea of having one of her own. I wasn't really on board at first. Horses were expensive, and I didn't see the point. But I wanted to make her happy. We had no kids yet, and if a horse was what would fill that space for her, then who was I to say no? So, after months of hearing her talk about it, we finally bought Jasper. I can still picture the day we brought him home. Julia's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her smile was radiant, her eyes gleaming with joy as she led him into the stable we'd had built on the property. It was almost like she'd found a new purpose. At first, I didn't mind. I liked seeing her happy, and I thought it was just a phase, something she'd grow out of once the novelty wore off. But the thing is, it didn't. If anything, her bond with Jasper only grew stronger. Every morning, she'd be out there with him, brushing his mane, feeding him, and riding him through the fields. And every evening, after work, she'd rush home, her mind already in the stables before she even walked through the door. It wasn't until the late-night visits started that I began to feel uneasy. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, saying she needed to check on Jasper. The first few times, I brushed it off, thinking it was just her being a caring owner. But as it became more frequent, I started to wonder, was this really about the horse? Or was something else going on? I tried not to let it bother me at first. Julia had always been passionate about animals, so maybe this was just an extension of that. But the more I watched her with Jasper, the more it felt like I was competing for her attention and losing. Our conversations became shorter, more surface level. "How was your day?" had become a question that seemed obligatory rather than genuine. And half the time she was out of the house before I even finished telling her about mine. Her mind was always with Jasper, always thinking about what he needed or how he was doing. And I was left with this gnawing feeling in my chest, like something essential was slipping away. It didn't help that the few times I mentioned how much time she was spending with him, she'd brush it off, laughing lightly as if I was overreacting. "He's just a horse, James," she'd say, smiling at me like I was being ridiculous. "You're my husband. Of course you come first." But that's the thing. Her words never quite matched her actions. One night, I came home from work later than usual. It had been a long day at the office, and all I wanted was to have dinner together, maybe catch up on that series we'd been watching. But when I walked into the house, it was empty. The kitchen lights were off, the living room cold. She wasn't there. I knew where she was. The stable. I walked out into the cold evening air, the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots as I made my way to the barn. The lights inside were dim, but I could hear the gentle murmur of her voice. She was talking to him. Jasper. I stood outside for a moment, feeling ridiculous for even being there. This was silly, right? I mean, it was just a horse. What was I so worked up about? But as I listened to her whisper softly, something inside me twisted. I couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken to me like that, with that kind of tenderness. When I finally walked in, Julia didn't even flinch. She didn't jump or look surprised to see me there. She just turned her head slightly, a casual smile on her lips, as if it were perfectly normal for her to be spending time with Jasper late at night, while her husband sat alone inside. "Hey," she said, brushing a hand down Jasper's sleek neck. "I didn't hear you come in." "I didn't want to interrupt," I replied, trying to keep my voice light, though I felt anything but calm. "You've been out here a lot lately." "Yeah," she said, her smile softening. "He gets a little antsy in the evenings." Just trying to keep him calm. I wanted to tell her that I was the one who felt antsy, that I was the one who needed her to keep me calm. But the words stuck in my throat, too afraid of what they might reveal. Instead, I just nodded, giving a small shrug as if it didn't bother me. "All right," I said, "I'll be inside." And with that, I left. It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was the start of something I didn't like. The unease that had been building in me for months was now impossible to ignore. I was losing her. Maybe not in the way I'd imagined when I said my vows, but I was losing her all the same. The next few days passed with that same sense of quiet detachment between us. Julia was still her usual self, at least on the surface. She'd laugh at the same jokes, smile the same smile, and kiss me goodnight before bed, but something was missing. There was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a distraction that I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a phase, that she'd eventually grow tired of the routine with Jasper. But that thought never settled. Every time I saw her slipping out of the house to check on him, or heard her giggling in the barn, it was like a weight pressed against my chest, heavier with each passing day. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room, the TV flickering softly with some show that neither of us was really watching. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, wondering if I should say something, ask her if she was okay, if we were okay, but I couldn't bring myself to start the conversation. It felt like admitting there was a problem would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. So I stayed silent, and so did she. After a while, she got up, stretching with a small yawn. "I'm going to check on Jasper before bed," she said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I watched her go, the doors swinging shut behind her, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. The silence felt deafening now, and I realized that this had become our new normal. Julia and Jasper, and then me. I stood up, feeling restless, and wandered into the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging on as I poured myself a drink. I took a slow sip, leaning against the counter as I stared out the window. The barn was barely visible from where I stood, just a dark outline against the night sky. I tried to imagine what she was doing in there, talking to him, brushing him down, maybe feeding him an extra treat before calling it a night. I slammed my glass down on the counter, harder than I meant to. This was getting ridiculous. I wasn't the jealous type. I wasn't. But something about this, something about the way she was so wrapped up in that horse, the way she seemed to be slipping away from me, was gnawing at me in ways I didn't know how to handle. I needed to talk to her. Really talk to her. But not tonight. No, tonight I let it go. One more night wouldn't hurt, right? The following weekend, we had plans to go out for dinner. Just the two of us. It was something I'd been looking forward to, thinking maybe it would give us a chance to reconnect, to feel like us again. We hadn't had a real date night in months, and I hoped it might be the thing to pull her attention away from the barn, at least for a little while. But as the day wore on, Julia seemed distant, distracted. I could tell she wasn't fully present, even when she was with me. She'd check her phone, then glance toward the window, as if waiting for some unseen signal. When it was time to leave, she hesitated. "Maybe we should reschedule," she said, her voice uncertain. "Jasper's been acting a little off today. I don't want to leave him alone." I stared at her, my heart sinking. "Julia, we haven't gone out in forever. One night won't kill him." She bit her lip, clearly torn. "I know, I'll worry the whole time." The frustration bubbled up before I could stop it. "Worry? About a horse, Julia? He's fine. He's a horse. You're acting like he's a child, or something." Her eyes flashed with something. Defensiveness, maybe? Hurt. "He's not just a horse, James. You know that." "No," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "I really don't know that. Because it seems like all you care about lately is that damn horse. I don't even remember the last time you cared about us." The words hung heavy in the air between us, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Julia looked down, her expression softening into something that resembled guilt. But just as quickly, she hardened again. "I do care about us," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But Jasper is a big part of my life, and you knew that when we got him. I'm sorry if you don't understand, but I can't just ignore him when he needs me." I opened my mouth to argue, but then I saw the look on her face, the determination, the unwavering resolve. And I knew there was no point. No matter what I said, it wouldn't change anything. She'd already made her choice. "Fine," I muttered, turning away. "Do whatever you want." I walked out of the house without looking back, my footsteps heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away, even if just for a little while. I needed space to think, to figure out how the hell we had gotten here. The night air was cooler than I expected as I walked aimlessly down the street. The hum of distant cars and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated the silence around me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. How had we gotten here? A year ago, we were happy. No, we were more than happy. We were solid. Julia and I had this unspoken connection, a bond that felt unshakable. But ever since Jasper came into the picture, things had started to shift. I felt like I was slowly losing her, bit by bit, to something I couldn't compete with. I stopped at the edge of a park, staring out at the empty playground. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, creaking with every gust. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the anger, the jealousy that gnawed at me. It was irrational, right? To feel this way about a horse? I should have been supportive, understanding even. After all, she was my wife. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on, something we weren't talking about, something that was pulling us apart. I needed to get out of my head. Pulling my phone out of my pocket, I hesitated for a moment before dialing Ryan's number. He was one of my oldest friends, the kind of guy who didn't sugarcoat things but always had a way of making sense out of the mess. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't wrapped up in the middle of all of this. The phone rang a few times before he answered, his voice groggy, as if I'd woken him up. "Hey man, what's up? Everything okay?" I sighed, leaning against a lamppost. "Not really. Can we meet up? I need to talk." "Sure. Give me 20 minutes," he replied without hesitation. That's what I liked about Ryan. No questions, no fuss. Just straight to the point. We met at a small bar a few blocks away. It wasn't fancy. Just a quiet place with dim lighting and a few booths in the back. The perfect spot to talk without interruptions. Ryan was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer and giving me a nod as I slid into the seat across from him. "You look like hell," he said bluntly, eyeing me with concern. "What's going on?" I shook my head, running a hand through my hair. "It's Julia. It's everything." He raised an eyebrow. "Everything like?" I sighed, leaning forward. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. Ever since we got Jasper, things have been different. She spends all her time with him, like he's the center of her world. And it's not just that. It's like she's pulling away from me. I feel like I'm losing her, and I don't even know how to talk to her about it." Ryan frowned, taking a sip of his beer. "You think she's replacing you with the horse? Or is it something else?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice quieter. "It's stupid, right? To be jealous of a damn horse. But it's more than that. I can't explain it. She's distant. She doesn't talk to me the same way she used to. It's like I don't matter anymore." Ryan sat back, thinking it over. "Have you told her how you feel?" "I've tried," I said, frustration seeping into my tone. "But every time I bring it up, she brushes it off. Says I'm overreacting. That Jasper is just part of her life. But I don't think she realizes how much she's changed, how much we've changed. Maybe she's dealing with something you don't know about," Ryan suggested, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people throw themselves into something like a hobby, a pet, when they're trying to avoid dealing with deeper stuff. I mulled that over, the idea gnawing at me. Was there something going on that she wasn't telling me? I thought back to the nights she stayed out in the barn with Jasper, the way her eyes would glaze over when she talked about him. Was it really about the horse, or was it about something else entirely? "I don't know," I muttered, shaking my head. I feel like I'm losing her, and I don't know how to get her back." Ryan was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice steady. "You can't fix this if you don't face it head on. You've got to sit her down and make her listen. Tell her how much this is affecting you, how much you're hurting. If she loves you, and I know she does, she'll hear you out." I nodded slowly, knowing he was right. But it was easier said than done. The thought of confronting Julia, of forcing a conversation we'd both been avoiding, made my chest tighten with anxiety. What if it didn't go well? What if she didn't see things the way I did? What if she didn't want to fix things? Ryan seemed to sense my hesitation and gave me a firm look. "You can't let this eat away at you, man. You got to fight for what matters." I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of determination mixed with fear. "Yeah, you're right. I'll talk to her." "Good," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "And hey, if you need anything, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone." I nodded, grateful for the support. But as I walked home that night, the weight of the conversation ahead of me pressed down like a heavy stone in my chest. I knew I had to talk to Julia, to lay everything out in the open. But the closer I got to the house, the more my nerves twisted inside me. By the time I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Julia had already gone to bed, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wind against the windows. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring up at the darkened staircase. Tomorrow, I told myself. I'd talk to her tomorrow. But tomorrow came and went, and I still couldn't bring myself to say the words. Every time I looked at Julia, I saw the distance in her eyes, the way she seemed to drift further away from me with each passing day. And every time, I let the moment slip away, telling myself I'd try again later. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us grew like a shadow that neither of us could escape. We were living in the same house, but it felt like we were miles apart, trapped in our own worlds. Julia continued to spend most of her time with Jasper, while I threw myself into work, avoiding the conversation that loomed like a dark cloud over our marriage. It wasn't until one evening, when I came home early from work, that everything came crashing down. I found myself sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the wide expanse of the countryside. It was beautiful, serene even, but my mind was anything but. Every morning, I would see Julia walk out to the stables, always with that same eager spring in her step, as if nothing else mattered in the world but Jasper. It had been like this for months now. She'd spend hours with that horse, brushing his coat, feeding him, whispering to him in ways I never quite understood. It had started innocently enough. We'd moved out here to the countryside to escape the city, to find peace. She'd always had a thing for horses, ever since we'd first met. They're majestic creatures, she used to say, her eyes lighting up whenever we passed a stable or a field. So, when she brought up getting a horse of her own, I couldn't say no. At the time, it felt like a small price to pay for the joy it brought her. We found Jasper a magnificent chestnut stallion, and from the moment he arrived at our small farm, it was like she'd found a new purpose. At first, I admired the way she threw herself into caring for him. I'd even join her in the stable some mornings, pretending to share the same enthusiasm. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. The mornings turned into afternoons, and then whole evenings. I'd see less and less of her, even though we lived under the same roof. I'm not a jealous man, at least I never thought I was. But as the days blurred into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the time she spent with Jasper. It was the way she looked at him, the way her hands lingered on his coat, and the way her laughter echoed through the barn whenever she was with him. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just her love for animals. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. One evening, after she had been out in the stables longer than usual, I decided to go out there. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, maybe nothing at all. But as I approached the barn, I heard her voice, soft and soothing, like she was speaking to an old friend. The doors were slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing them open. There she was, standing beside Jasper, her hand resting on his neck. But it wasn't the usual scene of her brushing him or feeding him. It was different. She was closer, her face inches from his, her eyes closed like she was lost in some private moment of connection. I stood there frozen, feeling like an intruder in my own life. "Julia," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched, her eyes snapping open as she stepped back from the horse. "Oh, hey," she said, forcing a smile as if nothing had happened. "I didn't hear you come in." "You've been out here a long time," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "I was getting worried." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, brushing her hands against her jeans. "Jasper just needed a little extra care today." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. "You're spending a lot of time out here lately." She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "He needs me." "I need you too," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I wasn't sure if I meant it as a joke, or if I was finally admitting the truth of how I felt. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. Guilt, maybe? Or was it frustration? I couldn't tell. "I know," she said softly, her voice almost apologetic. "It's just, Jasper's special. I couldn't argue with that. He was special. But so was our marriage, or at least it used to be. I felt like we were losing something, drifting apart, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. The weeks that followed were more of the same. Julia became more distant, and the tension between us grew. I'd catch glimpses of her in the kitchen, her mind clearly elsewhere. And when I tried to talk to her, it felt like she was only half listening, her thoughts still with Jasper in the stables. One night, as I lay awake in bed, listening to the rain tap against the window, I made a decision. I had to confront her, to talk about the elephant, or rather, the horse, in the room. This wasn't just about time anymore. It was about us, and the future we were supposed to be building together. The next morning, I waited until she finished her usual routine with Jasper before sitting her down in the living room. I watched her closely as she settled into the armchair, her eyes already darting toward the window, probably wondering when she could go back to the stables. "Julia, we need to talk," I began, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. She blinked, turning her attention to me. "About what?" "About Jasper," I said, watching her expression carefully. "What about him?" she asked, her tone defensive. "You've been spending a lot of time with him," I said. "More than with me." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He's a horse, Michael. He needs care, attention. You know that." "I do," I agreed, leaning forward. "But it feels like it's more than that. It's like you're choosing him over me." "That's ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "You're being paranoid." "Am I?" I pressed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because it doesn't feel that way. You barely talk to me anymore. When was the last time we had a real conversation? Or even spent an evening together?" She stared at me, her eyes flashing with anger. "I didn't realize I needed to report every minute of my day to you, Michael." "That's not what I'm saying," I shot back, my voice rising. "I'm just saying that I miss you. I miss us." There it was, the truth laid bare between us. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way her emotions warred with each other. But instead of softening, she crossed her arms over her chest and stood up, turning her back to me. "I can't do this right now," she muttered, walking toward the door. "Julia," I called after her, but she was already gone, the door swinging shut behind her as she headed out to the stables once again. I sat there in the silence, my heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about Jasper anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface for a long time. And if I didn't figure out how to fix it, I was terrified that I would lose her for good. As the days passed, I could sense the tension between us growing. It was like an invisible wall, building itself higher with every unsaid word. I'd come home from work and find Alice in the stable, always with Pegasus. At first, I would call out to her, but after a while I just stopped. I'd stand there in the doorway of the stable, watching her brush him, feed him, talk to him softly. She was so absorbed in her world with that horse that it was like I didn't even exist. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that I was being unfair. After all, she was going through a lot with the pregnancy, and her passion for Pegasus was just a way to de-stress. But it wasn't just that. The baby was coming, and I felt like I was being pushed further and further away. One night, I decided to confront her. I was tired of feeling like a stranger in my own home. The storm outside had calmed, but inside me, the storm raged on. I waited until she came back into the house, her hair slightly damp from the misty evening. She smiled at me, but it was a distracted smile, her thoughts still with the horse. "Alice," I began, my voice tight. "We need to talk." She looked up, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "About what?" "About this. About us," I said, waving my hand between us, trying to express the gap that had grown. She sighed and leaned against the counter. "Sergio, if this is about Pegasus again, it's not just about the horse." I snapped, more forcefully than I intended. "It's about how much you've distanced yourself from me. From us. You spend all your time with him, and I feel like I'm not even here anymore." Her brow furrowed, and for a moment, she looked hurt. "You know how much I love Pegasus, Sergio. He's helped me through a lot, especially now that the baby's coming. I thought you understood that." "I do, Alice. But it feels like there's no room left for me. Like I'm competing with him for your attention." I paused, trying to find the right words. "I need you." I need us to feel connected again." She looked down at the floor, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting the edge of her sweater. "I didn't realize you felt that way. I thought you were okay with it, that you knew Pegasus was important to me." "I do. But I also thought we were important too," I said quietly. "I miss you, Alice. I miss the way things used to be between us." For a long moment, she was silent, and I feared I had said too much, that I had pushed her too far. But then she looked up at me, her eyes softer than they had been in weeks. "You're right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been so caught up in everything with the horse, with the baby coming, that I didn't realize I was pushing you away." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid for too long. "I just want us to find a balance again, Alice. I don't want to lose you." She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "You're not going to lose me, Sergio. I promise. I love you, and I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't matter. You do, more than anything." I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "I love you too, but we need to figure this out. Together." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We will. I'll try to be more present, I promise." That night, for the first time in weeks, we went to bed feeling like a team again. The distance between us had finally started to close. But even as we lay there in each other's arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. The connection we shared was still there, but the cracks in our relationship had been revealed, and I knew it would take more than one conversation to repair the damage. Over the next few weeks, things began to improve. Alice made an effort to spend more time with me, and I tried to be more patient, understanding that her bond with Pegasus wasn't something I could or should compete with. But there were still moments when I felt the pull of jealousy, moments when I'd see her with the horse and wonder if I would ever fully have her attention again. And then, one evening, everything changed. Alice was out in the stable again, and I was in the house trying to keep myself occupied. I glanced out the window and saw her standing by Pegasus, her head resting against his neck. They looked so peaceful together, so intimate. A familiar pang of jealousy stirred in my chest, but I pushed it down, reminding myself that this was part of her life now, part of who she was. But something about the way she lingered there, the way her fingers stroked the horse's mane, made my stomach churn. I couldn't explain it, but an uneasy feeling crept over me. I stood up, intending to go outside and join her, to maybe offer a peace offering of sorts. But as I reached the door, I froze. Through the dim light of the stable, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Alice was whispering to Pegasus, her voice soft and soothing. But it wasn't just her words that sent a chill down my spine. It was the way she looked at him, the way her hand lingered on his neck, her body pressed close to his side. There was something too intimate, too familiar about the way they stood together. My heart raced, my mind spinning with possibilities, each one more irrational than the last. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was overreacting. But the nagging doubt wouldn't leave me. And then I saw her smile. It wasn't the smile she gave me, not anymore. It was a smile of pure contentment, a smile that told me, in that moment, she was happier there with him than she had been with me in a long time. I stumbled back from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, hurt, jealousy. But most of all, I felt lost. Lost in a sea of doubt, not knowing where I stood in my own marriage. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Was I imagining things? Was my jealousy twisting reality? Or was there something more to her connection with Pegasus than I had ever realized? The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Alice was already in the kitchen, making breakfast as if nothing had happened. I watched her, trying to read her expression, trying to see if there was any trace of guilt or remorse. But there was nothing. She was the same Alice she had always been, warm, caring, loving. But something had shifted in me. I couldn't shake the image of her in the stable, couldn't forget the way she had smiled at Pegasus. It haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making me question everything. As the days went on, I found myself avoiding the stable, avoiding the sight of Alice with the horse. I didn't want to face the growing tension inside me. Didn't want to confront the possibility that I was losing her. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the doubt lingered. And I knew, deep down, that something had to give. One evening, after another long day at work, I came home to find Alice in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. "Sergio," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Pegasus, something's wrong." I rushed to the stable, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, I saw Pegasus lying on the ground, his breathing shallow. Alice knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear. "I don't know what happened," she sobbed. "He was fine this morning, and then suddenly he just collapsed." I knelt beside her, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch Pegasus. His once strong body felt weak and frail beneath my fingers. The sight of Alice, so broken, so vulnerable, pulled me out of the spiral of doubt I had been trapped in. In that moment, all my jealousy, all my insecurities faded away. What I saw before me wasn't a woman who had chosen a horse over her husband. It was a woman who was about to lose something she loved dearly. We called the vet, but there was nothing they could do. Pegasus had suffered some kind of internal complication, something they hadn't detected before. That night, Alice and I sat together in the stable, holding each other as we watched Pegasus take his final breaths. It was heartbreaking. I had never wanted this. For all the jealousy I had felt, for all the tension that had built between us, I never wanted her to lose him. Not like this. After Pegasus passed, Alice was inconsolable. She spent days locked in our room, barely eating or sleeping. I tried my best to comfort her, but there were no words that could take away the pain she felt. I could see the emptiness in her eyes, the way she seemed to drift through the days without any sense of direction. But as time passed, something shifted in her. Slowly, she began to heal. She started spending more time with me again, and the distance that had grown between us began to shrink. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when I could see the grief in her eyes, the sorrow that lingered just beneath the surface, but we were finding our way back to each other. One night, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Alice turned to me. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know I pushed you away, and I know I got lost in my own world with Pegasus. But I never stopped loving you, Sergio." Not for a second. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I know, and I'm sorry too. I let my jealousy get the better of me. I should have trusted you more." She rested her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we both sat in silence, content just to be in each other's presence. The tension that had once threatened to tear us apart was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the love that had always been there, even in the darkest of times. We never spoke much about Pegasus after that. His memory remained a bittersweet part of our lives, but we didn't let it define us. Instead, we focused on the future, on our growing family, on rebuilding what we had nearly lost. And as the days turned into months, and the months into years, we found our way back to each other. Stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever. In the end, the horse had brought us together, not torn us apart. But it wasn't without its challenges, and it wasn't without its heartache. Love, like life, is never simple. It's messy, complicated, and full of unexpected turns. But it's worth fighting for.